your risk appetite is that you could lose $10 million. Because the board of directors may turn and go, I don't want to lose more than 5.
You're listening to KBcast, the cybersecurity podcast for all executives. Cutting through the jargon and hype to understand the landscape where risk and technology meet. Now, here's your host, Carissa Breen.
Sean, welcome back to the show. How's it going?
Yeah, good. Yourself?
Yeah, good. It's been a while since I've spoken to you on the show, 6 months, I think. So I'm keen to really dive into, a lot's changed since then, and I'm keen to get into the topic. So what have you sort of learnt anyway since we last caught up on the show?
I guess loads of things have probably changed since, I think, August last year. So, look, I think the big thing is we, especially in Australia, at least anyway, and probably obviously many parts of the world, we went through sort of subsequent waves of COVID. I think businesses started to see that level of, stepping up yet again to ensure there was some sort of level of resiliency. And at least from a cyber standpoint, it was more a case of, the attackers or the adversaries didn't really sort of sit on their hands and do nothing. I think we started to see an escalation continue, as it always has been escalating. So, yeah, look, I think we just started to see a lot of activity. Businesses wanting to do more, businesses growing, some people struggling as well, but at the same time, how to make sure that the lights are always going to be on.
Yeah, it's interesting because, so much has happened in the last few weeks, which we're going to obviously get into. But do you think that now, as we sort of traverse into this new sort of world because of what's happening in, Russia, Ukraine, all that, it's really going to change the dynamic of how we operate as a society, but two, then as a security industry?
Yeah, good question. I think what we've probably learned over what's happened the last 20 plus days at least, and obviously even leading up to sort of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, I think the biggest challenge is geopolitical issues and geopolitical risks as something that every business leader should really be taking into account and factor that into the overall sort of risk management strategy. We always need to be looking at not just simply what could happen to us directly, what could be the byproduct of that. And when you think about areas such as supply chain, we saw that firsthand when it came to at the start of the pandemic. We saw many people, struggling to even get just simple basic components that they needed to procure, to sell, to really sort of make their own technology and services and products work. And I think, yet again, we need to start thinking about that because, a geopolitical issue could actually cause a supply chain issue for us as well.
Great point. Byproduct. Do you believe people think about that at all? Because, for example, if this happens and it doesn't work out, then potentially something else could go down. Do you think people think about that, or do you think that they're so busy trying to get their own head above the water, let alone think about anyone else's?
I think it's a mixture, and it's hard to. I think you definitely cannot sort of tar everyone with the same brush and say absolutely they do or they don't. I think it's a mixture, and I think that really comes down to the level of maturity that organisations have. When I think about have people gone through the process to understand, one, who their suppliers are, who their most material suppliers are that could cause a material impact if they were no longer available. I think sometimes that's where some organisations probably have been a little bit lax. Others definitely think through it. Others have got some very key supply chain risk management programs in place. Others have not even thought about what they should actually do in that space.
Okay, so let's discuss a big topic that's going around the industry at the moment. You obviously are very immersed into this topic, which is supply chain. Lots going on in the world, as we've just sort of touched on briefly before. But where do you sort of see the biggest threats to supply chains at the moment?
Look, I think there's a couple of elements to it. So if I think about it from just general, in terms of what we've sort of seen coming out hopefully coming out of the end of the pandemic, we saw, manufacturing disrupted. We saw people basically getting COVID. People were basically, the reduction in force in some areas. We saw delays. We saw a range of different factors. And that obviously then flows on to, people like ourselves, consumers. It could be down to manufacturers that are waiting to receive their own goods so they can get their components out there. Take the example of, if you wanted to buy a brand new car right now, there's going to be a very, very long wait time because it's actually hard to get microprocessors to put inside some of those cars. Why is that? Well, there's supply chain issues when it comes to the microprocessor part. And that could be something as simple as you going to a furniture store and buying some furniture and, no longer is that lead time 10 weeks. It could be, 18, 20 weeks. But when you think about it from the cyber context, businesses right now are really trying to get themselves out there, pushing a brand new product route to market service, and we're moving a million miles an hour. And when I think about from a building and developing applications, we're borrowing code from bits and pieces of other people's code that they've actually created. So think about your GitHub, Bitbucket. Developers are just simply going there and borrowing components or bits of code. They're putting it together and creating an application that you're going to probably be using, some sort of custom application, and that's now productized. So what happens if there's actually a vulnerability in that? Are we actually going back in time to see, what are those components? What are the binaries that are being used? What code was actually used? And that concept of shift left, shifting the element of, as we start to build some technology, as we start to deploy it and run it, are we looking at every single factor of that piece to secure it? That's effectively supply chain. Now, when you think about some of the most recent ones, just before Christmas, we saw the Log4j vulnerability. Log4j is a binary that's really there to collect information around, how are people using this particular component or particular application. And, people are actually using that in commercial off-the-shelf applications. So vendors are scrambling around trying to work out, well, do we use it? What's the vulnerable version? How do we patch it? Patch came out, it caused some other issues. But people also started to use those particular binaries to create custom applications inside their own organization. So now we're quickly running around and trying to work out what's the bill of materials of all the software and all the components that we're using inside our organization. And that starts to spawn this bigger challenge of, do we have a software bill of materials? And this concept called SBOM, which was talked about probably about 10 plus years, is now back on the table. And again, this is a supply chain. So that's one aspect. The other part to it is, think about in Australia, think about any large country around the world. It's fair to say that the majority of the top 20, top 30 organizations probably make up a very large part of the GDP of that particular country. But what serves underneath that, or I guess what serves those larger organizations is the underbelly of every country, which is those small to medium enterprises. In Australia, we've got 90+% of small to medium enterprises is effectively that. So what happens if they get impacted and we're focusing all of our attention on the top end of the town only? There you go. Your supply chain basically gets hit. And, how porous is that underbelly of the country? That could be actually pretty big, because some of these organizations don't really think that far ahead around how do they secure themselves. And I think that's the challenge that we need to keep on thinking about. It's not just simply, let's look at the people that can afford to do it. We should be thinking about how do we protect the people that can't actually protect themselves.
Okay, so there's a lot in there. One of the things that was coming up for me as you were talking is the delay side of things. Now, over the last few years, we've had, like, if I go back and look at this, so you had, delays on getting certain, I think it was wood from the US, for example, into Australia, for example. So I'm curious to know, with the delays, is it going to get worse? And then I guess the other side of the coin is with the supply chain side of things, because we can't get certain items or minerals like fuel, for example. What's sort of going to happen then? Is it just going to keep skyrocketing? Like what really is the go?
So I think there's, I think you've touched on a couple of key pieces there. One, I think we've got a bit of a perfect storm. There's this pent-up demand from consumers that really want to try and, get as much things as they can. Take the example of any type of product that's actually out there, any consumable item. We're buying a lot more. And when it's struggling, when we've got manufacturers that are struggling to even sort of get some of those raw materials or the components that are needed to create those particular items, we're just going to see this exacerbated problem effectively, where people are waiting, people are demanding that they're getting their products. We're buying more, we're trying to buy more, but manufacturers just can't even keep up, and the raw materials can't even be pulled out of the ground or whatever it may be. So I think we're going to continue to see some of these challenges.
Sorry, Sean, just a quick question on that. When you say we're buying more, why are we buying more? Is it because people are stressed that we're not going to get any more, or they're worried, or they're doing sort of the hoarding thing? Why is that?
So I think it depends on some countries where some people really didn't spend a lot of money during the pandemic. So now there's this pent up, okay, well, I've got all this extra money, this extra saving, so let me go buy more. You've got other people that just continuing to, so you've got that element. And then the other part is people are just very keen to get out there and just, start living life again. And that could just be not, overbuying, like that hoarding piece that we saw at the start of the pandemic. I think it's just more a case of people just want to get out there. People want to live life and sort of put that part of their lives behind them and, treat themselves to new things. We didn't go out and buy, we weren't doing the annual holiday to Europe or to any other part of the country because we couldn't really sort of move around. So we just had this extra supply of cash that's sitting there. So let's start using it. And then when you think about the renovations that were taking place, we saw the building boom take place. If raw materials can't come into the country, well, that's when you can start to see delays. We saw, I saw some people actually, the cost of their build, dramatically go up just because the raw materials weren't even available.
I know. Oh my gosh. Everyone was home renovating. I remember that period of time. I think we've moved past that now. So with the delays, and I know maybe I derailed you before only because I was curious as to why people were buying more. Is it going to get worse? Because now it's like, I think at one point in Sydney, like there was the food delay. And then, if we're getting to that level, which is like necessity of eating, like what's going to happen to like human beings? And like, how bad is it going to get?
Look, I'm not going to be an alarmist and say that the world's, the sky's falling or anything like that. But I think that the challenges that we're looking at right now are, you've got material scarcity. You've got the increasing freight prices that are actually sort of going up. And when you start to add fuel costs, well, freight prices are obviously going to naturally go up because of that. It's hard to demand some accurate forecasting. And I think I'm seeing that across a lot of the earnings calls that people are sort of popping up. You can see that there's some sort of little movement there in some organizations. Because there's been delays in unloading containers at ports, you've naturally got a port congestion. So there's going to be sort of that extended delay that takes place. Our attitudes have changed. I think there's a lot of people that are thinking differently about the way that they want to spend their money, do stuff. And then the backdrop of that is digital transformation. Think about the start of the pandemic. Many organizations probably had some sort of transformation program in place. But every business probably sounded the alarm and said, okay, we're going to go as fast as we can. You said you're going to do it in 3 years? Great, you've got probably 3 months. Or, you've probably got a very shorter period of time. And that's where it became a rapid, if not radical, transformation because they needed to do something. They were going through that element of survival. How do we ensure that we can maintain our business? How do we maintain some form of productivity? Let's quickly do that as fast as we can. And that's where we saw some challenges where people are now starting to feel the effects of, we didn't really think about that. And, people moved out to public cloud as an example, didn't really think about securing it the way they should have probably thought about securing from the start.
Yeah, it's so true. So going back to your example before, just to walk through so the listeners are aware of the couch, for example, and to sort of paint the picture. So you gave the example about the couch and then if supply chain like is impacted and how that sort of affects the consumer buying a couch, for example. So can you maybe talk through that in a little bit more fidelity, just so people know exactly that relates to them? Everyone's probably bought a couch in the last 5 years, so we make it very, very practical in terms of what this could look like for any person out there on the street.
Yeah, so a couch is one of many examples, and I think we all probably sort of experience this as well. There is, if you look at any products that's, let's just say technology product, probably even easier for the majority of your listeners. Technology products are actually made up of a series of different components. And when we started to have border closures, we saw that a range of different factors were coming in due to the pandemic. We saw that people just had some extra cash because they weren't able to go out to restaurants and bars and the like. So they thought, well, let's just buy more. People couldn't keep up with the demand of what products they actually wanted to, what products were needed to be fulfilled, and then what products were actually on the shelves. And that happened from everything from smartphones to cars. We saw people simply going into a store and it could be something that's non-technical or known technology involved, such as a couch. And because of the delays of getting the raw materials, because of the delays of manufacturing plants shutting down because of COVID and obviously the staff actually being impacted, we just saw these extra delays every single time. If you buy a couch and it's actually made overseas, guaranteed you're going to be waiting 12 plus weeks at the best of times. I think many people probably waited 16 to 18 weeks, and I saw they actually waited 20 weeks for a couch. Buying a brand new car right now, there's probably a 6-month wait, and it's not because it's some fancy sports car. It's actually just going to take an extra long bit of time because it's taking them a long time to make them. Think about some of the cars that come out of South Korea. It was only a couple of days ago that we saw 600,000 COVID cases just in that country.
Oh, yes, you're so right. So do you think that now, I mean, we've been going through this stuff, this turmoil for 2.5 years. So do you think that we've gotten any better? Are we sort of well equipped? Because I feel that, I mean, it's not linear. So sometimes we go okay and then it falls back down again. So what's your sort of hypothesis around, will things get better? Have we learned some of our lessons and the sort of the failings, and we can sort of move forward with the new data points that we've got now?
Look, I'm going to be the eternal optimist and say absolutely we will. I'd like to think that we will. But I think the element's going to be that some organizations are not as mature as others. When you have a very large supplier that is core to your business and they actually go offline, that's a very hard proposition for you to actually continue to sustain and be resilient as a business. So I think many people probably need to start thinking about what are the extras, what other suppliers could I go to? Are there other suppliers that you could go to? There's not really one single source of a supplier for any products at the best of times, but obviously prices go up. And can you sustain the same margins that you've actually had before? And we've seen some organizations that want to maintain some level of profit margin they've had in the past. They never let go of stuff. And you think, how could you let go of stuff when it's actually core to your business? Take the example of logistics. Some people were actually letting go of people that were doing deliveries for products. And you think, how is that even possible when it's the busiest time of the year? It's even busier than, kind of the Christmas holiday period. But some people just want to maintain that level of profit margin that's actually there. And that's each their own. That's their own business. But, we're going to continue to see these movements more and more. And I think when you start to add geopolitical issues, you start to add, the pandemic, you start to even just the backdrop of the pandemic there, we're going to continue to see this for a while.
So I'm curious now, I mean, from our chats historically, you sort of said that people aren't as focused on the supply chain from a security perspective. Why is that? And then how do we sort of get people focused on the supply chain?
I think a lot of it really comes down to identifying, firstly, who are your suppliers? So I'll take the example, and I'll use some sort of hypothetical numbers, but if I look at Palo Alto Networks, we've probably got 1,000 suppliers that are listed in SAP right now. These are people that we've sort of vetted, we've gone through the process and said, these are our core suppliers. But out of that list, let's say there's 10 that are considered material. This is where you've gone through the process to work out, if these are my crown jewels as our organization, if these are things that literally make the lights, keep the lights turned on, we derive revenue from some of those core components. These are the people that I really want to sort of have a very close look on. And I know that people go through their their supply chain risk management programs, and they may actually send out a document that's like, here's 700 pages. Please let us know how you actually do security in your own organization. If I sent that out to 1,000 companies, that's going to take a very long time to get the answers back. And then if you start to apply that sort of rigor on every single person and that gets applied onto everyone else that's out there, all of a sudden we've just got people that are filling out compliance reports for the sake of filling out compliance reports that maybe no one's going to be looking at. Whereas I would rather focus my energy and effort on, these are the people that literally could cause material impact to me if they're no longer there. So how do I raise the bar somewhat? How do I really manage the risk that's associated with it? Not just simply, do you use antivirus, do you use multi-factor authentication, but really driving change there. They're the ones that I really would want to focus on it. And the other part to probably also note, when you are forcing people, and I say forcing, the term loosely, when you are telling people to actually fill out a form and it's not core to their business, like let's say cybersecurity is not core to their business, you're actually detracting from what's core to their business. And they're going to be spending more time filling out a document that really you're probably not going to really pay that much attention to. So I think, again, that's a key thing. So identify your key suppliers, how are they linked to your crown jewels, and how you actually sort of run a business. I think the other part to that one is, how do you actually start to grow as a business? And that could be building your own software applications. That could be a case of using third parties to actually use developers to actually build that. So are we going through the practices of identifying if there is any type of malicious vulnerability or component or something that's actually there that could cause us some harm in the future? Then when you think about the suppliers that actually do come into your own organization physically, have we vetted them? Have we gone through some sort of rigor to see what's actually going on? Because many times people can actually see that there's some sort of unauthorized production of goods. We've seen counterfeits in the past, or insertion of counterfeits into that sort of supply chain, tampering, theft, insertion of malicious code, sometimes development practices. And I think the development practices for me are the ones that we're probably not focusing too much attention but it's actually causing us pain and has caused some organizations a lot of pain.
So, do you believe people would know their top 10 suppliers that are that could generate material impact? Do you think that most people would know that? Maybe not off the top of their head, but they've got a list somewhere.
I would assume that someone would know something inside their own organization. But if I think back to, let's just say the last 22 years working in security and having a similar question that I've probably asked in various guises over the years, what are your crown jewels? Some people cannot actually answer that. And I won't say that's consistent every single time, but some organizations cannot actually answer the question of what are your crown jewels. And if you think about it, they can't identify what's actually material. I don't really think that they've got a very high hope that they would know all of their key suppliers that are actually material to them.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that makes total sense. So if you've got like 1,000, that's quite a lot. Do you think it's harder to sort of cut down? Like, obviously, if you're cutting from 1,000 down to like 100, that's probably pretty easy. But when you're sort of getting down to like the last like 20 down to 10, do you think that that's a little bit of a harder process depending on who you ask? Because I mean, you're speaking to someone in like HR versus someone in finance, for example, they're going to have very different viewpoints. So how do you sort of come together from a place of unity to make that decision?
I think the big thing is, and you kind of sort of called it right out, it has to be cross-functional. If we were to let someone that's in, let's just call it security, actually go through the process saying, let's actually identify our cybersecurity, risk management or from a supplier standpoint, they're not going to know who are the key suppliers. They may look at a name that's sitting in SAP and say, ABC Incorporated, what do they do? Oh, okay, is that really material to us? That's where we'd have to go through and understand, what's material to finance, what's material to HR, what's material to, technology providers, system integrators. You'd have to go through and have a cross-functional team to go through that process. And I think making the third-party risk management absolutely has to be the priority in any organization. Identifying, prioritizing those supply chain vulnerabilities. What could also happen? The what-if scenarios is absolutely key. Engaging your suppliers a little bit early and start to say, if we're going to onboard someone new, what are some things that I actually would want to ask them, straight off the bat? If they need to get some sort of remote connectivity to our systems and servers, have we gone through a process of actually sort of vetting them? Think about standard due diligence, the cyber due diligence part of it. Am I buying an organization that potentially is going to be riddled with challenges that I have no idea what's going on? And if you think about the examples, we've seen that many times before. People buying during the acquisition process where they found that there was a breach and all of a sudden the price of that acquisition dramatically dropped. People have to be looking under the covers, looking in the closets to work out, is there a gap? Is there an exposure? Could this actually harm us today, tomorrow, or the day after?
Can you provide some examples around what are some of the questions that people can ask, at a high level when they are doing the vetting process, for example?
Yeah, look, I think a lot of it would be, how do they actually just protect themselves? So if I had someone that was actually building hardware components, I'd want to make sure that they've actually got some form of security to their own organization. How do you actually mitigate threats that are coming inside your own organization? If these are people that are building, technology that, may be going into government, defense industrial base, do you vet any of the people? Have you gone through some sort of process? So looking at everything from people, process, technology, it's not just simply a technology thing. We'd want to know, how are you actually securing yourself? How do you protect yourself, protect your own organization? I think that first and foremost, that's going to be a key part. And then if you look at each of those three branches, what are the questions? People, do you vet them? Have you gone through the process of actually doing background checks? If it is sensitive in nature, that is. From a technology standpoint, what tools do you use? I would be a little bit concerned if I was actually working with an organization that said, oh, it's okay, we actually use some free antivirus technology off the internet. That's how we actually do security on all of our desktops. I'd be like, okay, that's not really going to help me out. So I'd want to make sure that they're actually doing something like that. People accessing their applications are using multi-factor authentication. How do you actually do those types of checks and balances? Processes. If there was an event, if there was some sort of material impacts that took place to your own organization, how would you identify it? How would you do the triage? How would you then go through the process of remediating and responding to that? That should be a documented process somewhere. Mean time to detect, mean time to respond are actual values and numbers that we all look at, right? And hopefully many people look at as well. We'd want to understand how quickly could you respond if something went wrong. And that would actually show me pretty quickly if someone's actually mature or not. If someone said, oh, we don't even do that, or we don't even have a process of how we'd actually go through that. Lucky we have never been impacted. If I heard terms like that, I would probably get a little bit nervous.
Yeah, and rightly so. So there was a time in my security days where we were dealing with a very, very large supplier, well-known brand. And obviously we had to ask all these questions, and part of the process was, do you do pen testing? And that was, yes, of course we do pen testing. And then we're like, okay, cool. We sort of said, well, we need to pen test it ourselves. And they were like, no. So I guess I understand why, but the theory is, from our point of view, when I was working on the client side, is more so, well, you could sort of just get anyone off the street to like do a very preliminary pen test, right? Doesn't mean you're going to find anything. So how does that conversation work? Because I mean, at the end of the day, no one wants to be exposed. No one wants to sort of lose their spot on a panel if you are working with a big corporation. And I get the reasoning for pushback, but then how do you sort of find that middle ground?
I think it's an element of trust. And I think that's where, like everything that we do in life, if we trust someone, we're probably going to go that little bit extra to do something with them, for them, whatever it may be. If people are a little bit guarded, and that kind of falls or reminds me of the old days in the operational technology networks where people used to say it was security through obscurity. Let's not tell anyone how these systems work, because if we don't tell anyone, then no one's going to be able to break into it because they won't even know how to break into it. That's great. That didn't really work out too well for us, and I don't think that's actually a great strategy. Being open, being collaborative, I think is actually the way forward where you can build some level of trust. If you think about if someone's going to have a web application as an example, external facing, if a pen test was to be, you can't use, your pen testers can't be used to check this. Here's the report and just follow the report and that's it. I'm sorry, but an attacker doesn't actually follow a report, and an attacker doesn't actually go through change process either. So if it's external facing, anyone and everyone can basically sort of do that. And I think sometimes that's the vantage point that we'd actually need to think about as well. What the attacker sees is not necessarily what our tools and telemetry actually are telling us as well, because everything that we're doing usually is focused on inside. It's not really showing us that view of externally, what does my organization look like? Because that's the vantage point that the attacker has. If I'm buying, if there's mergers and acquisitions that are taking place, and, I'll take the example of Palo Alto Networks again. We've gone through a decent amount of acquisitions the last 3 and a bit years. Every single time we go through that, we need to understand what is it that we're buying. Do they actually have instances that are sitting in various clouds? I once spoke to an organization that said, we were only sitting in 2 clouds, AWS and GCP as an example. And then when scans were taking place, you say, well, you're actually in 25 different places because you're in a colo over here, you're actually working with Orange Business Services over here, you're in NTT's data center over there. This is the footprint, and that's the footprint that an attacker will use. That's the beachhead to get inside an organization. So again, going through that process, saying we need to do this for our own due diligence and testing, and I think that's where partnerships and trust are actually sort of formed. Blocking people from doing that doesn't really work out too well because they may decide to go somewhere else.
Do you think using the words DD or due diligence gets people a little bit on the back foot, perhaps?
Always. And I think the other part of that is, let's make sure that it's not seen as some sort of, I'm going to do an audit on you. Governance,
all those words are worrying.
Oh, look, governance is something that I think has to be there. I'm not a massive fan of the point and shoot. This point in time, we've done an audit and we're okay. You and I both know, having worked in this industry for a while, things can change 5 seconds after that report came out to say everything's green. Take the example of, going back a little bit, Microsoft Exchange vulnerability that impacted on-premise Exchange servers. What happens if I did a scan 5 days before that actual scan to say, we're all good, everything's amazing, there's no vulnerabilities. But then as soon as that vulnerability comes out, it's like, I've now got a gaping hole in exposure to my organization. How would you know? And I think this is where we need to move beyond that audit piece of once upon a time, we do this every quarter, every year. It has to be real time because the world that we're living in is extremely dynamic. Cybersecurity as a whole is extremely dynamic. And then when you start to add geopolitical issues, threats that change all the time, ransomware groups moving from here to there, pivoting, the changing face of the adversary, that happens all the time. And that will always happen in between those, every quarter type of scans that take place. Because that's the thing that can actually sort of, get you undone very quickly.
So, Sean, can you talk through some strategies perhaps? So, focusing on the real time, yes, I agree with you. You've handed over a report and then something fails off the back of that, but it doesn't matter because the report that you sent across is what they're sort of basing everything off. So, can you talk through some strategies that provide oversight about a company to sort of gain insight on their suppliers? Like, what does this look like?
So there's a couple of different things. So if you want to have a look at your suppliers, I think the first steps are, one, there's capability that you can actually use or leverage open source intelligence effectively, where you can say, tell me what this organization looks like. And if you were to do a scan of that organization, you've got to work out what does their landmass, how big and small is that organization? What are the domains they've actually got? What do they own? Are they actually protected resources that are actually out there? And, going through using some open source tools can help you out, but obviously it's going to take a little bit of time. There's also commercial tools and services that actually allow you to do those scans and continue to maintain some sort of monitoring around what's going on. If I think about what we do at Palo Alto Networks as an example, we have obviously tools and services that allow us to do that. And these were tools that we had started to use probably 18 months before we decided, let's actually acquire this solution or this particular company, because we believe there's going to be some value for our customers as well. And that's just real-time scanning. And effectively, anything that's connected to the internet, we're going to scan the internet a couple of times per day and see what are all the assets that belong to that particular organization. If there's a change, if there's a vulnerability, you'd be able to see that. Because if I can see that pretty quickly, you can guarantee that an attacker is going to see that pretty quickly. But it also does require you to have some sort of a process around, once you've got that information, it's kind of like once you've got the report, what do you do with it? Does it sit in an in tray? Or have actually built some sort of a process to be a little bit programmatic around, if this actually happens, we need to know about it. An alert needs to be fired off. There needs to be some sort of a triage take place. People need to rally around and say, okay, what do we do now? Let's start to act. Because as soon as that clock starts ticking, the attacker's also got the opportunity to start saying, well, I might have a bit of a go and see what I can actually do to get inside that organization as well.
So what do you do now? So, for example, you've done a real-time scan, sitting there, what's the next step?
How do we go through the process of answering the four questions when it comes to risk management? Do you either accept the risk, avoid it, transfer if there is the option to transfer, or mitigate? And I think that's the key thing that every business leader needs to think about, those four questions every single time. There's no point me spending $1 million to protect an asset that's going to be $1. The value is $1. Can I mitigate the risk? Is there a way that I can mitigate it? In the event of a vulnerability popping up, could you roll out a patch? Well, there are no patches. Okay, well then what's the compensating control that I could use to mitigate that? If there is a way that I could avoid the risk, is it a case of simply applying someone to actually protect that, whatever that it may actually be? An example of avoidance could be take a paper backup copy of every bit of data that you've got there. Probably cost prohibitive, but it's not going to also stop every single form of data loss that you've got as well. Transferring risk, I don't really see that as an option all the time. And some people see using an MSSP or a service provider is transferring risk. The risk always stays with you. Accountability will always remain with the organization because it's your name that's on the front page of the newspaper if you get breached. You can only transfer responsibility. But when you think about it like that, it's like, okay, well, what could we do? So if I'm an e-commerce provider selling some widgets on the internet, and for that part of the financial transaction, I don't want to store all the PCI information. I don't want to do that sort of payment card processing. So I just use a third-party payment gateway to actually do that. I'm transferring the financial risk to someone else to do that. And that's the part where I can say, okay, well, I've transferred that part out and I can manage the rest of the risk. These are things that every single business leader needs to always think about. Because that's how we start to work out what's our risk appetite. I can't walk into an organization and say, your risk appetite is that you could lose $10 million. Because the board of directors may turn and go, I don't want to lose more than 5. So having those conversations, working through that to work out what is your level of tolerance. Because when you think about some of the recent issues that we've seen, ransomware attacks is a great example. If you were to pay, and I'm not one for paying, because I think that's just a case of feeding the beast and potentially could be funding terrorist organizations as well. But if you had to pay because that was your way out, one, do you know what you're actually paying for? Would you actually get the decryption key if you needed that? Do you have a process? Would you work with law enforcement? I've spoken to people at Interpol before where People have been crippled and they got to law enforcement too late. It's like, we've had a decryption key for this particular ransomware for a long, long time. Yeah, and they'd already paid money for it. So understanding what could we do? Could we accept it? Could we just turn around and go, oh, that's okay, it's those particular systems. Let's actually just restore from a backup. Have you done a backup? Have you tested the integrity of the backup? And these are ways that we could start to either accept, avoid, mitigate, or transfer the risk. And every single time, there's always going to be those 4 options available to us, hopefully. But if not all 4, there's going to be something that you can actually use.
So just sort of pressing on the 4 options. So some of the challenges that happen within an internal sort of organization from a risk management perspective is you may have very conflicting views on, yes, I accept, no, I reject, no, that's someone else's problem. How do you manage that? Because I mean, if you're looking at business risk versus like tech risk and then, security risk, like you've got a lot of different opinions in the room that may not really get each other's point of view. They say they do, but again, everyone's got their own agenda. Everyone's protecting their area and their role. So how do you sort of come together? I've been in rooms before where people just couldn't agree at all. So how do we move past that? So we are getting the best outcome for the organization?
I think in the end, sometimes it actually has to come down to, whilst this may be something that's very, very important in my department, business unit, whatever it may be, does it actually align to what's important to the business? And where I sort of usually start that conversation, if I was just to be a complete outsider walking to an organization, I'm going to have a look at the organization. If they're a publicly listed company, I'm going to have a look at their annual general report that comes out. What do they call it as challenges? What do they call it as their strategic imperatives? And if someone wants to be talking about something that has nothing to do with the strategic imperatives, and no matter how you can actually link it to something, it still does not align, or maybe it's completely counter to that. How is it important? I know it's in your wheelhouse and it's probably something that's important to you and you see that it's important, but that's where there's a disconnect between you and the business. And I think many times people have actually gone and say, we need widget X. Okay, what's it going to do? It's going to stop bad things from happening. Okay, how does that actually sort of align to the business? I think many times we have to actually go through and call it out and say, does this really make a difference? Have you looked at the risk register to work at the top 5 things that are there? Is it going to solve any one of those problems? No. Is it going to solve anything that's in the risk register? No. Why are we doing it? And I think that's where business leaders could also start to work out and understand that it's not, cyber risk, if you want to call it that. Drop the cyber moniker. It's just risk. And I think that's where we have to sit down and really play that translation between business to tech to business. That's how we start to get to that place. Let's not stop. Let's not go through this process of continuing to bamboozle people with big words like bamboozle and make people concerned about, I don't really understand this. It's a mysterious thing. Let's get someone else to do that. It's just risk. And let's go through the process. What's material to me? If that SAP server is actually offline, that's effectively the cash register to our business. That causes us to lose money. And people will actually know how much money you would actually lose if SAP was down in some organizations. We would not be able to do a bill of materials, a manifest. If our source code repository was down and you're a software company, that actually has a material impact. The integrity of your customers is up for grabs effectively. You start to see all those different things. So working out what your crown jewels are, working out the dependencies from those crown jewels, who are the suppliers that interact with that, that's actually the starting point that you need to think about. And that's where we start to have a program and build around that. Because doing something for the sake of doing it is not going to help us get there. And it's not going to help us achieve what we need as a business either.
One really quick way of knowing that there's a problem with SAP is when people start speaking in German, you know that there's a problem. Definitely experienced that before. So going back to align to the business, totally hear your point of view. What happens, though, if people lose sight of that? So, example, I mean, if you're in a 50,000 seat organization and you're just a drop in the ocean, cog in the wheel, whatever you want to say, it's really easy to lose sight of the overall goal. How do you sort of bring people back to sort of earth and say, like, I get it. I understand your point, but we've needed to focus on the big picture here because I think people do get lost in their everyday job. They can't see the actual company moving forward because they are, like I said, drop in the ocean in terms of how quickly that business does move forward.
I think a lot of that just comes down to culture. And that starts with the tone has to be set from the top. Leadership have a very, very fundamental piece to play here, and that is making sure that people understand the mission. Think about humans. We're purpose-driven. I want to know what my place is here. And people have to go through that. And I think whether it's senior leadership, exec leadership teams, just even managers, are you sitting down with your team to make sure that they understand what's the mission, what's the purpose, what are we trying to achieve here? And then how does that then relate to your job, your role? One of my favorite quotes or stories that I remember sort of hearing, many, many years ago was John F. Kennedy Jr. going to, I think it was the Florida Space Center, and walking down the halls, and I'm hoping that it was JFK, I'm not sort of butchering the story, but walking down the halls and basically spoke to a cleaner and said, "What do you do here?" And he said, "I'm helping someone get to the moon." That gentleman knew his purpose was because the big mission was that we wanted to safely get someone to the moon and back in the next 10 years.
Wow.
And that's when you think about it like that, that was actually someone that understood their role. They knew what they were doing. They were helping the cause of getting someone safely to the moon and back. And you think about your own organization, what are you trying to do? Your strategic imperatives. We want to be the best bank. How do we want to do that? This is how we're going to do it. People need to understand that it's not just simply a poster or a sticker or some sort of little slogan that you put in your email signature. People have to believe it. And that really comes down to reinforcing that every single time.
So if we switch gears for a second, I'd like to sort of focus on big corporations for a moment again. But you sort of touched on before, Sean, so some would implement like a 900-page questionnaire, sort of appease their auditor and, do their due diligence again and sort of relax their compliance team. But I mean, as we know, like this is not really practical for smaller sized businesses. Like it's going to take them 100 years to fill that out. They probably don't even have answers to half of those questions because they haven't been around long enough or whatever it is. So like what's going on here? Because I get corporations saying that, but to me, it's just not practical and it's just beyond for a lot of these companies.
I think that's where, in the spirit of partnership, call it out. What does this actually do for you? I've asked that. I've been on the receiving end of those types of questions as well. That's actually partnership, where you're actually being able to call out the other person and vice versa. I'm willing to put my neck on the line for someone if they're willing to basically do the same for me. And sometimes maybe I'll probably put my neck out a little bit further as well. But calling it out, what does this actually do for you? Think back to some surveys where someone just says, how do you manage security? We have a person. Tick. Okay, well that's good. You've got cyber window dressing.
Oh my gosh.
But it's not. It doesn't serve any purpose. No. How are you actually managing risk right now? If there's a complete disconnect between, the way they manage, or if there's disconnect between, there's no enterprise risk management. That there's actually going to be a problem there. Filling out 800 questions, providing 800 answers to 800 questions. There's no point even sort of going through that exercise. If there's something that's material to this organization that they're actually providing to you, and that could be an exposure point, that could be a jump point for someone to come inside your own organization, that hurts you. So what's the right way to do it? Manage the risk. Getting someone to fill out a survey, and I'm not trying to say that we should never do that, because a lot of the times we have to get some of this information. Someone could
There's levels to it, right?
Exactly. And that's where I think it's prioritizing who are people that are material. The person that delivers the garbage bins, as an example, to an organization, are they a material supplier? Well, to me, that probably wouldn't be. But someone that actually has the ability to take some of my code and then wrap it up and put it into an appliance, that's actually material. Because I'd be scared of, could someone actually tamper the goods that they're actually building? Could they do a range of different things? Have I chosen the right supplier because they build their products in a certain geography around the world? If I'm dealing with government, and let's just say US government, they're going to be asking a lot of questions. Where are you building these boxes? I need to be able to attest to that. I think that's the big thing.
So do you think that people, okay, so for example, going back to 800, questionnaire people got to fill out, do you think people are thinking, wow, we really don't need this? Or are they just following the process, like on the conveyor belt? All right, it's that person's job now. I've done my piece, and now it's on to Sam and John's job now to make sure we get those answers back. Do you think people aren't really questioning about why we're doing things? Because, I mean, if we were, perhaps we'd have a lot less of this problem.
I'd probably have to say, I agree. I don't think some people are actually questioning it. And I won't say it's everyone. If I want to manage risk, going to try and manage risk as much as I can for myself. Relying on someone to just give me some static piece of information that could be stale 5 seconds after they've actually sent it through, that's not managing risk. How do you actually ensure that you can instill that? Is there going to be some sort of rigor, some checks? If you're a material supplier and I've actually put you on the list of my 10 out of my 1,000 that you are material, if something happens to you, it hurts me. I'm going to be spending a fair bit of time with that organization. I'm going to be looking at them, and maybe I'm going to be looking at them externally. They will know full well what I'm doing, but let's be very clear. What I'm doing is probably the exact same thing an attacker could do. You need to be aware of that, because people are probably watching you to get into me. And we know everything around, that whole sort of third-party supplier attacks. If you wanted to do something, and let's just think of something that's on a very old piece, watering hole style attacks. I go to a particular, it's called abc.com.au as an example. I go to a news site every day, and on that news site, they're actually advertising, typical sort of banner ads. Well, if I know that my target or targets are actually going to ABC every single day to check the news, and I can't attack ABC because they're actually well protected. Why don't I just actually go to all the advertising platforms that are there, target them, serve some banners that potentially contain some sort of malicious code, and then I now compromise your system? Could that happen? Yeah. Has it happened? Absolutely. It's all basically playing that process around. If I really, really want to get to someone, I'm going to go through a lot of process to do it. And sometimes I'm not going to directly attack them. Take Log4j as an example. Were the organizations that impacted, were they the actual intended targets? Probably not. We're probably going to use some of that information for later attacks. Could have been some sort of just collecting credentials. You look at other ones, all the previous attacks that have taken place, and you think about it, were they the actual intended targets? Sometimes they weren't. Look at the organizations. There's ones that have popped up around, one-to-many. Cloudhopper, is a great example. Let's target one organization, a service provider, and compromise them. Was that the intended target? Never. It was the actual agencies, the government agencies in particular, that they were actually managing. Because all they had to do was just get onto one jump box, the Bastion host, to say that one host connects to 25 different organizations. And I actually want to get into one of those organizations. So we're always going to think about that's actually the third-party supply chain and risk problem that's actually there. Think about the NotPetya attacks. Someone broke into an accounting application in Ukraine, embedded some code in there, and then they got pushed out to every single other person. Kaseya, another example. Every single time we're seeing people that are actually going and saying, was that the intended target? No, but that's actually someone that I trust. And we have to go through and work out who are the people that we trust, and maybe sometimes we have to reevaluate who do we trust as well.
So true. So, if you're in risk, or you're in a risk, you're a risk manager, isn't that sort of your job to question things though? So for example, if you go to a doctor and you say I got pain on my chest and they don't question it, you're not really doing your job. So do you think that there needs to be this, like you said, coming back to the culture and the vision and all of these things to get people to question stuff a lot? Maybe we're not doing enough of that, would you say?
I think I'd say that we should never stop, and we should always continue to do that. And then in light of the world that we've probably lived in the last 2 years now, where we're remote, we have to be asking a lot more questions. We have to get more involved. We have to be more involved with our teams to challenge and challenge the thinking. Is this really the right thing that we should be doing? To use the term, to call BS on it. Let's call BS on ourselves. Is this actually what we need to do moving forward? Because this is the way that we've always done it. Think about, let's just say what I've done at Palo Alto Networks the last 6.5+ years. That playbook or whatever I've actually done the last 6.5 years is definitely not going to be the same playbook that I'll use for the next 6.5. I need to keep on sort of thinking about what are different ways, different approaches. Doesn't mean that everything becomes defunct, but I keep on building on it. Keep on asking questions, keep on doing things a little bit differently, more efficiently. I start to learn, I start to adapt, because that's the key thing. We always want to make sure that we can keep on adapting, because the attacker is going to do something different every time. Sure, the tradecraft doesn't really change that often. Tools and techniques, that changes all the time. So we have to adapt and change.
I love that. Keep asking questions, keep forward thinking, keep looking at suppliers. So Sean, really appreciate your time today, and thanks for coming on the show. Really appreciate it, and can't wait to get you back again for a third interview.
Awesome. Thanks, Carissa. Appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in. We hope that you found today's episode useful and you took away a few key points. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to get our latest episodes. If you'd like to find out how KBI can help grow your cyber business, then please head over to kbi.digital.
This podcast was brought to you by KBI.media, the voice of cyber.